what we have planned here in Tioga County for the 100th anniversary. Governor Cuomo first announced that all 62 counties would be participating in some way to recognize the anniversary of New York State women getting their first chance to vote in 1917. And I like to stress that because I don't know how many times I've said it, and people still think we're talking about 1920, and it's not. It's 1917, and it was 3 years before the women all over the country got the vote, even though there were other states before us. But I just like to make that clear because no matter how many times I say it, it just doesn't sink in. And I guess if you're not interested in history, that figures. The first thing we did was call a meeting, and we invited someone from each one of our 9 towns. And we explained, we have a core group. Our chairman of our legislature, Marty Sedore, is the chairman of our group. And there's about 5 people on our core group. So the first thing we did was call a meeting, and we invited someone or more than one to each one from each one of our towns. And we told them what we were doing and what we hoped they would do too, how they could participate. And then we asked them if they would take the message back to their towns and spread the word, get other people involved, and see what they could do to recognize the women's suffrage anniversary. One of the things that New York State is doing is making a New York women's suffrage trail. So what we're doing there is in every single town, wherever someone knows there might have been a suffragette living at that time, we're going to get the address and then put it on the map. So there'll be a website, and the map will show New York State, and then it'll show different little places on the map where suffragette resided. And today, Candor, Newark Valley, Owego, Nichols, Waverly, Spencer, and Berkshire all responded by featuring women's suffrage. And when Carol was talking, I just was bursting with pride because, gee, there's a couple of towns that aren't participating, and there's just got to be something they could do. They're planning parades, walking tours. Nichols made a quilt. Women would be featured at our museums. People are planting flowers in the suffrage colors, purple and gold. And, you know, just as simple as that even, you know, putting marigolds in next to some purple flowers. We hung some buntings from the courthouse. Other people bought some buntings, and they have flags, and they have little, whatever they think of that they could do to recognize women's suffrage. And I also have a historic marker going up for a woman in Owego who was the private secretary to Susan B. Anthony. The key event though for the county will be on Saturday, August 19th, and it's going to be at the county courthouse, and it will be open for the first time in years for tours. So we're going to have tours, speakers, music. We have Kurt Osgood with his dulcimer that's going to be playing, and I think we might have Melissa Collins with a harp. We're going to have displays, vignettes. We have a couple of people that actually have things from 1917 and in that time period. So it's going to be from 12 to 4, and as I mentioned before, volunteers are still needed. So if you feel like you'd like to help us in some way, or you don't even have to contact us, if you want to just go ahead and think of something cool that you could do to recognize the anniversary, that would be so appreciated. So that being said, I'd like to tell you how I feel. I think of this celebration for our 100th anniversary as a way to show our respect and thank the brave women who went before us. They took the brunt of everything. I have been watching and reading and learning so much about the women of the 19th century, and it's amazing. But I think what I consider the real kickoff for this anniversary is when the women first met at Seneca Falls in 1848. And although New York State wasn't the first state to allow women to vote, the credit is given to Esther Morris from Tioga County. She earned the distinction of being instrumental in getting a bill passed in Wyoming in 1869. That bill allowed women to vote for the first time in history anywhere in the United States. And although there were many women who worked hard for women's rights, in my opinion, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were the two most outstanding suffragists of all time. I've been reading their journals, their diaries, and in those journals and those books, they turn them into tomes. There are their personal letters, and they put everything in there. So it's like first person. And I'm telling you, I think that's why I get so fired up, because I feel like I've actually been conversing with them. Besides traveling and having 7 children, Elizabeth did most of the writing for Susan's speeches. She also wrote important documents, books. She wrote editorials for newspapers and just all kinds of things. She was a wonderful writer. Susan B. Anthony was more than dedicated in reaching out to as many people as possible. She urged them to approve women's suffrage amendments. She also wrote in her journal how it took courage and stamina to travel and travel to what seemed like every little dinky town on the map. She recalled how she would sometimes travel by stagecoach, but she would ride up on top with the driver, because when the horses, and I never even thought about this, but when the horses clopped along in front on these dusty roads, that dust all billowed back and went right inside the stagecoach. I mean, they might have had some canvas curtains or things like that, but she said she almost choked to death sometimes from it. And most of us today only picture a stage like they see in an old cowboy movie. But just think about it. Passengers from all walks of life could buy a ticket. So what if they didn't take a bath or wash their clothes in months? So what if they smoked foul-smelling cigars, or if they were half drunk? Not to mention women crying babies. No Ubers then. So in those days they didn't have smartphones or any phones, but they didn't have radios or computers. Besides the stagecoaches, they traveled on rickety trains, steamboats, even on rafts to cross the river. And Susan B. Anthony even rode a mule to one of her, in Colorado, to give one of her speeches. She toughed it out in order to speak to as many women as possible. And boy, there were so many days she was lonely. I mean, think about being lonely. That had to be a sad, sinking feeling. And she was fatigued. But boy, she went right on with it. And I mean, if that isn't dedication, what is? I mean, I don't know, I can't even think of anybody today that I see on the news that would ever, or I know, that would ever go that far. She would explain to the women, why it was important to go and vote and change the laws. Well, talk to their husbands, talk to the men, do whatever they could. She spoke in saloons, barns. She spoke on the back of lumber wagons. She spoke in private homes. One time she got, and it probably was more than one, she got delayed on the train or stagecoach or something. And when she got to the town, everything was closed and nobody was around. So she's sitting outside the train station. I mean, she didn't have any food. I mean, think about it. I mean, how could anybody be that dedicated? But she was. As time passed, traveling was taking its toll on Elizabeth. Besides caring for her 7 children, she had gained a lot of weight. She went up to 240 pounds, and she was only a little taller than 5 feet. And she had trouble walking. But one thing she continued to do was to write. And she wrote a lot, and she wrote very intelligently. And when she died in 1902, Susan lamented that after all of their struggles, they wouldn't live long enough to see the big day when women could vote. However, I think it was because of their struggles and because of all that effort that we got as far as we did in 1917. At the beginning of the 20th century, younger women took up the cause. Parades became a popular way to show that women were serious. And when they marched, they were pelted with rotten eggs, firecrackers, and called vile names, threw stones at them. But they marched on, and they made their point, I think, because people began to say, you know, geez, if they're that convinced, you know, maybe there's something to it. One of the younger women was named Alice Paul. Alice's mother was a suffragist. So I get those the words mixed up, but pay no attention. And she was a suffragist when Alice was still a little girl. So Alice became an activist at a very early age. And not only that, but she wasn't afraid to challenge the authorities. Along with other women, she picketed the White House, and President Wilson had them thrown in jail. When they refused to eat, they were force-fed with egg whites, and they stuck a tube. They pulled their arms back, and they stuck a tube up their nose, and they force-fed her 3 times a day. And the women who didn't want to be force-fed and said they would eat, they only got fed decayed food, rotten, disgusting food. And they were treated like they must have been murderers or something. It was so unfair. But they were all male jailers and things, and they just shoved the women in the cells, and it was just horrible. In 1916, when the Statue of Liberty was going to be lit with updated lighting by just flipping a switch, President Wilson participated by going down or going up the Hudson River in a yacht. And he was going to go there and flip that switch, and it was going to be a grand production. Then as his yacht got nearer to the island, he looked up and they could hear motors overhead. And they looked up and there were several biplanes flying around, roaring round and round. Well, they were piloted by women. And not only that, but they dropped these leaflets down on top of his yacht and on top of everything. And the leaflet said, "Votes for women." I'd like to have done that. So after World War I started, many of the suffragists cut back in their activities, but they still did what they had to do. They basically took over for the men that went to war. They ran businesses, and you name whatever the men did, they did for them. And people began to look at them in a new light, and they wondered, geez, if they can do all those things, why aren't they smart enough to vote? So finally, on November 6, 1917, an amendment to the Constitution was passed, allowing New York State women full voting rights. The first women in New York State to vote were the ladies of Lisle I'm afraid I have to tell you it was Broome County. But I mean, can you imagine, they got up in the morning, they must have been so excited. They get up in the morning, they probably got up way before they needed to, and they got dressed and they put on their hats, they piled into these old-fashioned cars, some of them had horns, and they made their way down to vote for the first time in their lives. Tioga County women voted 2 days later, and even had women on the ballot for school commissioners, 2 of them, and they won. And in Owego, the first ones to vote were 94 women. They showed up at Central Fire Station and on North Avenue. And when they got there were the men, and they were opening the doors for them, and they were welcome, oh, it's good to see you. And I thought to myself, yeah, they were probably on the ballot, and they wanted the women to vote for them. So, I mean, think about it, that's probably a fact. Well, I wish I had a candor woman I could really elaborate on, but I don't. So I picked one that I think is the most notable from our county, and she's still notable. Whenever you could Google her name anywhere and find her. Her name was Esther Morris, and I mentioned her earlier. She was an ardent activist and abolitionist. She was born in Spencer in 1814, and when her mother died, she was 11 years old, and they moved to Owego with she and her father, I imagine. And then when she got older, she ran a millinery shop. Then later she met and she married a railroad executive named Artemis Slack, and they had a little boy. A year after the baby was born, Artemis died, but he left Esther property in Peru, Illinois, where he used to be the chief engineer on the Illinois and Central Railroad. And but she was a strong, confident woman, and she said to herself, if he left me property, I'm going out there and claim it. So it was no easy trip or simple trip to embark on, and you know that. For one thing, the only train she could get out of Owego at that time was the old Ithaca and Owego Railroad. It was pulled by horses, and it sped like the wind at 5 miles an hour. She probably boarded the train in Owego and got off in Ithaca, got a boat across Cayuga Lake to make connections to the Erie Canal. From there she went to Buffalo, and from there she started getting on all these rickety trains, as I mentioned, and maybe stagecoaches. And she finally made it. And just imagine what it was like to travel with a baby. Don't forget, her baby was still in diapers. No Pampers then. And diapers had to be covered with a tightly knitted, well, like if you knitted a square out of real heavy wool, real tight and thick, then they put that over the baby's diapers. And we all know babies don't just wet. So I'll bet there were more than a few fellow passengers who wished they'd taken a later stagecoach. So when she finally arrived in Peru to claim her property, she was informed that women couldn't own property. So they talked it over and they said, well, since your child is a boy, we'll put the property in his name and you'll be his legal guardian, his official guardian. So that's what she did. Excuse me a second. So after staying out there a couple of years, she met and married a successful businessman named John Morris. And they had twin boys. I think she was 39 years old at the time. Those days, 39 was no spring chicken like today. But then John began to drink and things went downhill. The 1860 census noted about him, without business, no property. So Esther probably went back working as a milliner for a while. And then in 1868, John decided to move the family to a remote mining town in South Pass City, Wyoming, where they struck gold. So when he gets there, he immediately runs a saloon. And, but he did also go out and mine for gold when all the men left to do it. But while they were gone, the women were left alone for weeks at a time. They had to do everything. And the following year, in 1869, a move was on to create the territory of Wyoming, and one of the men running as a candidate for the legislature was William Bright. Esther approached him with a plea. She said, "Because if we prove that women are as capable as men by running our households, chopping wood, having babies, and running businesses while you men were gone," she asked if he won, would he incorporate into the Constitution of the new territory a clause that would give women the right of suffrage. In other words, give women all the privileges men had. And you know, out west, the men were very generous compared to the men in the east, because that's exactly what they realized. He did win the election, and she also promised to lobby for him and get her friends to lobby for him. Well, he knew she was a very well-respected woman, and he thought, well, she had a lot of clout, so he promised her he would. So he did. He won, and he did put the clause in. So on December 10th, 1869, Wyoming Territory granted the first equal suffrage bill in the whole nation to women. The first vote cast by women anywhere in the United States was September 6th, 1870. But not everybody was happy about it. When the local justice of the peace heard about it, he immediately resigned. "I quit," he said. "Perhaps a woman could fill my shoes." And the commissioners thought about it, and they said, "Hey, let's ask Esther." So they did, and she agreed, and they appointed her, and that made her the first woman justice in the United States, Justice of the Peace in the United States. And that still holds today. She served out a term of 1 year, and she heard about 70 cases. None of them were overturned. And the newspapers described her as a hard-bitten, upright dispenser of justice. They reported she took her oath of office in a calico gown, a worsted shawl, green ribbons in her hair, and a green necktie. They said she was nearly 6 feet tall, weighed 180 pounds, and made a forceful impression. So maybe that's why none of the cases were overturned. A year later, she had her husband arrested for assault and battery, and they separated. So he did her a favor 5 years later, though, and he kicked the bucket. So she didn't have to bother with him anymore. So then she moved to Laramie in 1874 to be with her son Edward. He was a newspaper editor by then. But she definitely stayed involved in the women's movement more than ever. When Wyoming entered the Union and invited her to the statehood celebration, she was chosen to unfurl the new 44 state flag. And that flag was stitched, every stitch by the women of Wyoming. They probably have it out there in the museum. And they referred to her as the mother of women's suffrage in Wyoming. In 1895, at the age of 83, she attended a dinner for Susan B. Anthony at Cheyenne. And while there, she was elected a delegate to the National Suffrage Convention in Cleveland. She died a month short of her 90th birthday, but she was far from forgotten. 2 statues of her were cast. One was a big 9-foot bronze, and it stands right smack in front of the state capitol building at Cheyenne. And there's a smaller one that was placed in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. One thing I have to tell you, it's a little anecdote about my husband. He went out to Cheyenne one year. He always brought his camera. And so when he came home, he told me, wow, you should see, when I was in Cheyenne, you should have seen the state capitol building. It's gorgeous, he said. But you know what sets it off? This beautiful statue of a woman that stands right in front of it. And he said, look. And he showed me the picture. And I said to him, oh, she's from Tioga County. And he says, yeah, sure she is. So I had to prove it to him, that was the fact. So I have a picture of it. And so I'll put it on the table if you want to look at it. But that concludes my talk for today. I do have one thing to mention. Carol Van Epps brought in some voter registration forms. And since we're talking about voting, if you need one, please feel free to help yourself. Maybe take one for a friend. But that concludes my talk, and I hope you learned a little bit. And if you have a little bit of spirit for volunteering, why, we can always use you or would appreciate whatever you did in your town. So thank you very much.
Emma, can you tell us a little bit about what is going to happen in the county as far as any special ceremonies or anything?
Well, I did. In each town, they're doing their little thing.
So it's in each town?
Each town, but the county itself is going to do their big thing in August 19th at the courthouse.
And that's the courthouse.
And that's the big deal, yeah. Because we even got them to wash the windows.
Do you know how many women in Tioga County took part in this, were suffragettes? Have you figured that out?
Oh, no, I don't know the exact amount, but there were quite a few. There were notices, articles in the paper about women meeting at the courthouse and naming different people from different towns. So when they went back to their towns, just like we asked people this time, they also spread the word. So I'll bet there were a lot of suffragettes around in the whole county that we don't know about, or we would find out if we really dug deep enough. Are there any other questions?
Do you know what the other towns are actually doing?
Well, I think, Newark Valley, they're having their parade, and then that Apple Fest and maybe something in their museum. That's Newark Valley. Berkshire, I think, is the Blueberry Fest.
Okay.
So whatever they're having, I asked them if they would at least, put a little focus on the 100th anniversary. So, let's see, Owego has got the courthouse, Newark Valley, Candor, Berkshire, Waverly, they're really going like busy bees down there. They're having a walking tour. They have great stuff in their museum from Sedore. And oh gosh, I don't know what else they said. And that was Waverly. What else do we have? What other? Nichols. They made a quilt, a beautiful quilt that's going to be on display. And I don't know.
About Spencer.
I did see some of the things that are in the museum in Waverly that the curator there has.
Yeah, there's a couple of women's dresses.
Yes, yeah.
Actually, they were actually.
And sashes.
Yeah. And we hung flags and buntings. People could buy them for their own homes or their own stores, and they're purple and yellow. And because those were the suffrage colors. And I think I told you I was putting up a historic marker. And and Spencer. And I think Spencer is doing something at their museum. So, yes?
You mentioned that she had a baby before all of this happened. Was she married?
Who?
Esther.
Oh, Elizabeth?
Yeah.
Esther.
Esther.
Oh, Esther.
More.
Esther, yeah, but her husband died when the baby was a year old. Yeah, and that's how she went out west, because he left her property.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, boy, and then she had twins after she got out there. So you can bet her husband didn't take care of them. And another interesting thing about Elizabeth Cady Stanton, she had 7 kids, and her husband was never home for even one birth. He was always out speaking about abolition. But somehow he found his way home. 7 times. And Susan B. Anthony got a little irritated at her. After she had her 6th baby, Susan said, "I'm tired of you being a baby-making machine." She said, "You know, we don't have time for this." And Elizabeth said, okay, I won't have any more. But she did, she had one more. But she was a good mother. I don't know if she was a good mother. But I heard the kids were really crazy little, disciplined in the neighborhood. Because she didn't believe in discipline. Yeah. So, any other questions? Yes.
Where did you get your flower? Where could I get one like that?
Oh, I just bought it. This one, I had this before the suffrage. Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
okay.
I got it at a store. But you could probably find one,
Mm-hmm.
you know. They have, and even if you can't find one with a pin on it, you can buy flowers, like artificial flowers that you buy anyway, and then break it off and then glue a little clip. This is like a little barrette, and then just glue it to the back and you got it made.
And I didn't bring my pen tonight, but do you have any of the
Oh, yeah.
pens?
Well, I have pens. I don't have pens
Can we get
to pass out, but I could show them to you.